Unfortunately, you can really whittle your diet down to like 5 things if you're on a low FODMAP diet. But again, it's really about eating small quantities of a lot of different things. You can eat a couple florets of broccoli. You shouldn't be eating like an entire bowl of broccoli. It's always about diversity and eating as many different types of plants as possible.
Do you know there are actually low-carb potatoes? I am calling all carb lovers. Now, if you avoid carbs because of gut issues like SIBO, IBS, or blood sugar spikes and wish you could incorporate them back into your diet, well, today I have Phoebe Lapine on the show, and she chimes in on ways we can still enjoy carbs in the right way. It all depends on the preparation, the quantity, and combining carbs with other foods, as well as really experimenting what works for you. She's the author of SIBO Made Simple and recently came out with her newest book, CARBivore. Phoebe has personally experienced SIBO, Hashimoto's, and several obstacles in life I feel we can all relate to, and she gives us some tips and tricks to help us expand our diet with carbs while still keeping our blood sugar and IBS in check and at bay. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And of course, you know this already, but you're listening to the Digest This podcast, and I'm your host, Bethany Cameron. Thank you, Phoebe, for coming on the show today. I cannot wait to dive into all things CARBivore.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so before we even get into the nitty-gritty, I like to start my podcast with some rapid-fire yes or no questions, and you can only answer yes or no.
Okay, I'm
ready. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right, first question. Do carbs spike your blood sugar?
Ooh, yes, but it's complicated.
Okay. All right. We can dive in later on too.
Yeah.
Second question. Do carbs contribute to candida?
Yes.
Okay. Are carbs from vegetables the same as carbs from beans, the same as carbs from rice and potatoes?
No.
Basically, is a carb?
No. This again, it's complicated.
Yeah. See, and that's why I just like to do these, just to kind of like pique my listeners' interest here. So, okay, next question. Can you reverse Hashimoto's disease?
Yes.
Okay, last question. Does gluten flare up autoimmune disease even if you're not gluten intolerant?
It depends on the autoimmune disease, but I will say yes because it can.
Okay. Also, does it depend? This is just like a personal question. Does it depend on the gluten? Like, does it matter if it's like organic, sourced from a different? Okay, it has nothing to do with that.
No.
Okay.
Molecular level.
So a lot of you know, back in October, I announced that I was dealing with mold in my lungs, and I have a huge team on my side, tons of different types of doctors, holistic, mold experts. I have Western medicine, Eastern medicine, and one of the mold experts that I am currently working with told me when we first met about all the different things to start taking to support the detox process of the mold. And one of them was actually Element, specifically Element. She said you need to get your electrolytes in, your magnesium, your salts, your potassium, and she wanted to make sure that I was doing an electrolyte drink mix every single day, despite if I was sweating, working out, etc. And so I was like, well, I already take that. So I just thought that it was super cool to have someone holistic in my corner recommending Element. I personally take the unflavored. They have tons of other flavors to choose from. I just love the unflavored. It's just simple, 3 ingredients, nothing else, no stevia, no natural flavors. So all that to say is I highly recommend trying Element. If you use my code DIGEST at checkout, or you can go to DRINKLMNT.com/digest. You'll get 8 free packs to try. And if you don't like it, Hey, guess what? You can give it away to a friend and they'll refund your money for whatever you purchased. No questions asked. So I feel like you have nothing to lose. Again, go to drinklmnt.com/digest. Okay, so if you're one of those people like myself who was always looking for water to be just easier to drink, like I am a person that just doesn't like to drink a lot of water. I don't know why. I've never been a water drinker. And having safe, clean water is, of course, just one more thing to have to worry about. And you don't want to do that. Unfortunately, according to the extensive research done by the EWG, 3 out of 4 homes in America have harmful contaminants in their tap water. Maybe that's why I never liked drinking water as a kid. Like we grew up on tap water and then I just didn't like drinking it. I don't know. Maybe that's just my theory. But more research is coming out that long-term exposure to high concentrations of PFAS can potentially lead to adverse health effects like cancer, endocrine system disruption, and liver toxicity, which is why I'm glad that AquaTrue removes all PFAS. The filters are affordable and long-lasting. No changing filters every 2 to 3 months. AquaTrue's filters last from 6 months to 2 years. I personally got my first AquaTrue back in 2022, and we have only needed to change the filters once, and that was actually quite recently. Just one set of filters from their classic purifier makes the equivalent of 4,500 bottles of water. That's less than 3 cents a bottle. Plus, you'll save the environment from tons of plastic waste. And best of all, the water tastes fantastic, and you don't have to worry about PFAS or other harmful contaminants. It's even portable, making it perfect if you rent or live in a college dorm. I actually had never heard of AquaTrue until I met my boyfriend, now husband, back in early 2022. And he was the one who influenced me to get one because he had done just extensive research on the best water filters out there. Thankfully, he's a nerd just like me, and he introduced me to AquaTrue. And let me tell you, the very first month I got the filter, I noticed clearer skin, and I was also just drinking more water in general because it actually tasted good. I had no idea what pure, clean water could actually taste like until I switched to an AquaTrue filter. And before drinking the AquaTrue water, I was just using the filter from my refrigerator fridge that typically comes out of your fridge, right? Huge difference from that. Now, it gets even better because AquaTrue comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee and even makes for a great gift. So, to all my listeners today, you'll receive 20% off any AquaTrue purifier. Just go to aquatrue.com. That's AQUATRU.com and enter code DIGEST at checkout. That's 20% off any AquaTrue water purifier when you go to aquatrue.com and use code DIGEST. All right, so for those listening, and for those that may not know who you are, because if they don't, they should, please introduce yourself and tell my listeners all about your journey, because I think it's really important that people know, not just listening to some, person on a podcast, but it's really important to know why you do what you do.
Yeah. So I have been a writer, a food writer for the last decade or so. And I started with absolutely no point of view that had anything to do with health. But then my own story intervened and I had to pivot my career and pivot my whole life and habits in order to deal with autoimmune disease. So I was diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis when I was 22. And at the time, I just quit my corporate job. I got my first cookbook deal. It was a book for fellow 20-somethings cooking with limited time, space, money, and skill. And literally on the eve of that book coming out, basically, I found myself like truly at health rock bottom. I had so many horrible symptoms that I didn't fully know to connect to my autoimmune diagnosis because I was so I chalk it up to immaturity at the time, but my doctor diagnosed me and told me, but wasn't someone with any sort of a holistic or functional approach. And so she was just like, hey, take this medicine and like go on living your life. And I was like, well, I feel okay. So I'm just not going to take the medicine and I'm going to go on living my life. And that was, in retrospect, not the right approach. I think I knew it inherently in my bones that the medication alone wasn't the answer, but I didn't have like the tools or the maturity to say, okay, like let's figure out what else I can do to move the needle. So instead, I just like kept living my life and living it hard, mind you, and ended up, like with total insomnia, exhausted all the time, hair falling out, horrible perioral dermatitis, like this rash on my face. I couldn't exercise anymore because I would just get a horrible cramp after like running half a block, whereas upon which I like used to run like 4 or 5 miles. And yeah, I eventually did end up in the office of someone with a more holistic approach, and they put me on Elimination Diet. And we discovered that way, and just like through various blood work, that gluten and I did not get along. And we'll get back to some of your rapid fire questions in a little bit, because I learned later on, kind of what the connection was with molecular mimicry and Hashimoto's in particular, and gluten. But I think at the time, like I was very lucky to have understood it from a visceral level, and like reintroducing the gluten and being like, oh my God, it's the gluten. I feel horrible. I'd always thought it was dairy for me because I was eating like pizza and like grilled cheese sandwiches and creamy pastas. And it didn't even occur to me that it was the bread and not the cheese that was making me miserable. So I went through like really like the 7 stages of grief, because I was going out to promote this book that I truly could not eat like half of the recipes in anymore. And also just, I felt like I was very much on like step one of my career. And even today, even though dietary restrictions are a bit more understood and accepted and prominent, at the time, like it was truly like you could not be a chef or food author if you had dietary restrictions. Like you could not write for the big magazines, you couldn't test for them. There was just a lot of jobs that I realized were off the table for me, and that was really painful. But of course, I just wrote my way towards a different type of career, and have since written a few books. My second book was called The Wellness Project, and it was kind of about how my life as a guinea pig, memoir about how I dealt with my Hashimoto's, kind of one step at a time, making one change a month for a year. And then after that book came out, again, mysterious symptoms started to creep back into my life. Like I always had gut issues as part of my symptom matrix, but I had felt better for a while. And then kind of at the tail end of that book tour, I was like, gosh, I'm like really bloated every time I eat. And strangely, I'm burping a lot. That's never really happened to me before. I'm like truly burping after every meal. And so I ended up getting diagnosed with SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And that was in, gosh, 2017 or 18. And so it was before like there was a lot of awareness about SIBO. And I thought the irony of it that was very funny is that I had done all this research on gut health for my book, The Wellness Project, and I had implemented so many like pieces of advice from microbiome scientists who say to, eat all the legumes, eat as much fiber as possible, eat fermented foods. And I was loading up on all these things, and I was just making myself more and more miserable. So I found like learning about SIBO and the low FODMAP diet and all these things to be really like hard for my brain to comprehend. And so I really wanted to dig in deeper. And that's why I ended up writing that book, SIBO Made Simple, was just to get to the bottom of, all of the really niche aspects of gut health that make it so hard for anyone to find like a one size fits all solution. And then, yeah, I emerged from that problem successful. I had a podcast too, where I interviewed you, and all of the divergent and convergent topics that involve SIBO. And then, yeah, most recently, I've been fascinated by carbs and how they affect our gut, our blood sugar, and how our blood sugar affects our gut. and vice versa. So yeah, sorry, long-winded story. That's where I'm at today. And yeah, I consider myself primarily a writer, I guess, at this point.
Okay, well, I can't wait to dive in because, first of all, I feel like a lot of people can relate in regards to the SIBO diagnosis.
Mm.
Were you ever diagnosed or treated for FIBO, which is, or excuse me, not FIBO, SIFO?
SIFO. No,
SIFO.
I wasn't. In fact, my SIBO was pretty straightforward in the grand scheme of things. I was pretty lucky. I had hydrogen SIBO. I just did one round of treatment, and I wouldn't say I was better, but I did get rid of the SIBO. And then I would say it took me about a year to get back to some semblance of normal, just because the healing phase takes so long.
Right. Okay. And then for those that don't know, SIFO is small intestinal
Mhm.
fungal overgrowth. Now, I am curious because you just came out with a book called CARBivore, and it's about carbs,
Yes.
assuming, right? I mean,
Yes.
you can only
Yes.
be like, okay, CARBivore. However, you also just said that gluten was a huge no for you. And I
Yeah.
think there's a huge, it's almost conflicting, right? And there's a common misconception perhaps about grains, carbs. Is
Mm-hmm.
it good? Is it not? Does it feed bacteria? Like, do you just live your life eliminating carbs forever? Like, how does
Mm-hmm.
one try and grasp something if they're just diagnosed with SIBO? And can you give us kind of some light on that?
Yeah. And by the way, all the questions you're asking are why I wanted to write about carbs, because I was just having so many people write me emails and message me off the back of dealing with SIBO, dealing with the low FODMAP diet, who are really, really scared of carbs and weren't quite sure where they fit into the matrix. And then also people with Hashimoto's who are like, do I need to do autoimmune paleo? Like, how low carb do I need to be? So I really wanted to dig into all those questions. And it's nice. I know your audience is fairly sophisticated. They must be like not by choice because they've had to learn about these complicated conditions. But specifically for SIBO, I mean, so SIBO is an issue of location, not necessarily type when it comes to our bacteria. So we just have bacteria colonized too far up the intestinal tract. So in the small intestine, that's where we ourselves digest our food, not digest our food, but absorb our nutrients. And so there's not really a role for bacteria. When they're there, they're kind of competing for those resources. Oftentimes it is bad bacteria that causes SIBO, but, kind of more of a blanket statement. That's not as much of the issue as the fact that, we have populations of critters kind of stuck in the wrong place. So what happens, of course, when they're trapped so far up is, all of this readily available food comes at them and they eat it and they produce gas. And that can make people really uncomfortable. And kind of the hallmarks of SIBO is just distension, like really having that gas, like uncomfortably trapped like an inner tube in your abdomen. And then burping, I did bring up because it's a really interesting symptom because again, like when bacteria are eating our food so far away from the exit ramp, it has to find some way out. So a lot of people will experience it coming out the other end. So with carbs, the low FODMAP diet is not necessarily a low carb diet in the way that, we kind of think of in the wellness zeitgeist. I mean, carbs as a slang term has kind of become synonymous with starches. So what we think of is grains, potatoes, pasta, corn, all of that jazz. But in reality, carbohydrates include all healthy vegetables, as you mentioned. They include starches and they include sugars. And those things are not made equal. And by the way, they include fiber. So fiber can be, is super important for our overall gut health, but can also make someone with an acute issue like SIBO really miserable. So it's a journey and it's about finding a happy medium where, we're able to use fiber as a superpower to control our blood sugar without making any sort of imbalance worse. So, ideally with SIBO, you want to actually eradicate the bacteria that's in the wrong place and kind of encourage your digestive system to kind of work the way it's meant to, meaning that things move, seamlessly through our system, and that bacteria can live in our large intestine where it has so many different functions, including eating the fiber that's left over from our meals and, helping it to prosper, controlling our immune system, so many different things. So the low FODMAP diet is actually an acronym for different types of carbohydrates that include a lot of really what we think of as really healthy vegetables, but it's just certain fibers that are particularly appetizing to our gut critters and to our good gut critters too. And they may produce the most gas essentially and make us the most uncomfortable, but it's not necessarily something that for someone with a high functioning gut would be bad at all. In fact, it's a lot of things that, again, those microbiome scientists tell us to eat. And then, kind of the issue of starches and quote unquote refined carbs or simple carbs is, the effect that it has on our blood sugar metabolism. And we know that our blood sugar metabolism and our gut health kind of go hand in hand. Having too much volatility with our glucose levels is not great for our motility. It's not great for a host of different things involving our gut. And then we also know that having dysbiosis also has a negative correlation with our blood sugar metabolism. And that's what I've discovered with researching all this stuff is that everything is a vicious cycle and goes hand in hand. And it can be really confusing for that reason. But I like to think of it positively in that there's always one in. So as long as we can attack our healing from one angle, we're going to see kind of a positive halo effect across our body in a lot of different areas.
Yeah, I think you pointed on a lot of different topics that we can even dive into even more. But one is being fiber. There's a huge fiber controversy. And I think personally, I don't think it's like a one size fits all because I know some people, they work great with certain fibers or they work great on a high fiber. I personally function better and my gut functions better on a low fiber diet. And I have no issues with constipation. I have a bowel movement at least once a day, no issues. Maybe TMI, but anyways, all that to say
no, we love to hear it. We love to hear Daily BM.
Yes. And it's like clockwork for me. But anyways, all that to say is, and then I do notice when I eat a higher, a meal with a lot of fiber, I will have a lot of gas. I'll have, what's the word? It'll just be really uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And like you said, sometimes I'll burp a lot.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh shoot, I shouldn't have eaten that or whatever. So I have to really be conscious of that. Again, other people are like, I need fiber. Otherwise I am just constipated. So, what would you say for those that are still trying to figure it out? Are there actually specific foods or fibrous foods that we should definitely stay away from? Or is there a gray area?
I mean, I do think a low FODMAP diet, if you have IBS symptoms, is not something you should necessarily adopt as a lifestyle, but is an interesting elimination diet to do because most people, and it is a complicated one because again, it's a long acronym, and when you reintroduce, you're kind of going one type of food at a time. But most people are not sensitive to the entire acronym. Most people kind of are able to zero in on one or two things that are triggering in particular for them. And I would say that it's never a long-term sentence. You can change your gut over time. You can heal your gut over time and eventually reintroduce some of those things that may have been triggering for you in the past. I think where people get into kind of a rut or into kind of a place of diminishing returns is when they stay on it for way too long. Because we do eventually, change our microbiome, even, our good gut critters. And the data does say that if you're on the low FODMAP diet for, upwards of 8 weeks, you do run that risk. So I would say that's an interesting place to start. On the low FODMAP diet, I will note that you are definitely able to eat a lot of starches. You're able to eat rice. You're able to eat any gluten-free grain. You're able to eat some corn products for the most part. You're able to eat potatoes. So it's not necessarily a low carb diet, a low starch diet in the way that we think of it. It's really,
What?
about controlling symptoms.
Okay, give us an example of foods that are not allowed on the low FODMAP diet.
Sure. So some of the biggest triggers for people are legumes and then high inulin vegetables, which include garlic and onion. And I think those are probably the hardest things to remove because it makes it so hard to eat out. And a lot of people are just like, I don't even know how to cook anymore because like I have garlic and onion in every single recipe. And for me as a chef, that was the biggest fear. But I actually really learned how to be creative, and the recipes in SIBO Made Simple, I mean, I still make a lot of them. They're a lot of my favorite dishes. And I found myself off the back of that. And it's been like, 5+ years now of me, being more of an omnivore again. But I do find that I really rely less on them just as my default with all of my cooking now, even though I can tolerate them. So then fructose is part of the F in the acronym. And so it's high fructose fruit and some vegetables as well. So it's really about the ratio of fructose to glucose. So table sugar is fine because it's kind of like a 50-50, but like agave, like anything that's really high in fructose wouldn't be allowed.
What about
And
honey?
then honey, it depends. And there's like, because not every type of honey is made equal. Like there's some types of honey, I think it's clover honey that tends to be lower in fructose, but generally on the low FODMAP diet, so you don't have to like think about it too much, people choose maple syrup over honey.
Okay. And what about nightshades?
Nightshades are actually like some of the only vegetables allowed on the low FODMAP diet. So unfortunately, like a lot of the kind of high fiber, woodier vegetables. So that's the way I like to think of them. So like kind of like artichokes, asparagus, avocado actually is really high fiber, kind of stringy, mushrooms, butternut squash, Brussels sprouts, broccoli
These
is
are
kind of those are not allowed.
these are not allowed. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. But again, it's not really what makes the diet very complicated and annoying is that it's not always, a black or white thing. It's a quantity based issue. So I think like unfortunately, you can really whittle your diet down to like 5 things if you're on a low FODMAP diet. But I think if we look at like the positive side of, or the positive influence on the diet, it's really about eating small quantities of a lot of different things and making sure that you're not like overloading your plate with, you know, like you can eat 1/4 of a cup of chickpeas, but you cannot eat like an entire bowl of chickpeas. You
Oh
can
gosh,
eat
yeah.
like a couple florets of broccoli, but like you shouldn't be eating like an entire bowl of broccoli. And I do think that that's actually like a really positive lesson when it comes to anyone's gut health. It's always about diversity and eating as many different types of plants as possible. And I think a lot of people will say, "Oh, I can't eat that. It gives me, I can't eat legumes. Like it gives me so much gas." I'm like, "Well, you just tried to eat a bowl of 3-bean chili. Like there's another." There's another way to
Totally.
integrate legumes as more of a garnish rather than saying I can't eat that at all. But I think in our culture, like we have such an easier time with restriction and strict omission than we do with moderation.
I am going to cut to the chase and tell you that Peak Tea's Radiant Skin Duo is on special right now. Just laying it out there because, as most of you know, I am a huge fan of Peak Life Tea's crystals and all of their matcha black teas and tropical powder teas. I drink them on the regular. So I feel like I'm just doing an injustice if I didn't tell you about this amazing sale right now. I seriously love all their tea crystals and the fact that they do not use any toxic tea bags, which can contaminate your tea and your drink in general just by having the chemicals that are in the bags leach into what you're consuming. I'm not sure if you guys know this, but a lot of tea bags, if not all, are just toxic. But Peak Life, all their products are tea bag free. And their products are certified organic. They are triple toxin screened for heavy metals, pesticides, and mold. And I don't know if you knew this either, but a lot of tea companies are now adding natural flavors to their teas. And we all know from my viral Instagram video showing how natural flavors aren't actually natural at all. They're actually made in a lab and are added to products to make you more addicted to that product you're consuming. Natural flavors, toxins, and chemicals are hijacking our taste buds and disrupting our endocrine system and gut health. So again, that's why I love Peak Tea, because they don't use any of that. And they do rigorous testing to make sure all their teas are free from toxins and mold. And if you're looking for a coffee alternative, Peak has a blend called Chaga Energy Elixir, which is 100% caffeine free, yet still gives you energy without the jitters and can even provide a calmness at the same time. But if you're looking for a deal, check out their website because they are always having specials. And so I really encourage you to go check out what's on sale right now, especially their Radiant Skin Duo. And if you're not sure if you're going to like any of their teas, they have a free return policy within 30 days. So if you try something and you're not happy with it, just send it back like what you didn't use and they'll just give you a refund. I mean, I just love that about this company, that they just want you to be happy and satisfied. So if you go to peaklife.com/digest, you can receive up to 15% off plus up to 2 free gifts. Again, that's peakuelife.com/digest. peaklife.com/digest. I have to tell you this story, Phoebe, because this was literally just like last week. Speaking about like portion control, because we had asparagus and we had like this really yummy dip, and I was dipping I was using the asparagus almost like as a fry, and I was dipping it in the dip. And I was like, oh, this is so good. And I think I probably ate like 10 asparagus spears. And that really like kind of upset my gut, where I'm like, well, dang, I've had asparagus before, but previously it was like 3 spears versus like 10. Yeah. So to your point, like quantity does matter because you can definitely go overboard.
Yeah. And that's why I like to do like different types of like stews or stir fries when you just add like kind of a clean out the fridge meal. But in doing so, you end up, with not too many of each ingredient on the plate.
Okay. What about dairy? Can we talk about that for a second? And does the type of dairy matter, like cultured yogurt versus cheese,
Yeah. So I didn't even mention that. So in the low FODMAP diet, it's not dairy free, but it's like low lactose, because lactose again is a sugar. So a carb. And it's really like you can have, again, like kind of small amounts of certain hard cheeses, more hard cheeses versus creamy cheeses, because again, they tend to have less lactose at the end of the day. But yeah, so there's a kind of a spectrum.
So no cottage cheese for all my cottage cheese lovers?
I don't know. I actually don't know about cottage cheese, because I'll just be frank with you.
Okay.
From a personal bias, I cannot even look at cottage cheese. Okay. So I've never personally looked it up in the low FODMAP app to see what the content is. I know it's like really hot right now as a protein, like a hidden protein additive, but I just I can't with the texture.
I'm just trying to give you a hard time. That's all. But I'm sorry. Keep going. So hard cheeses are better.
Yeah. So it's like milk and heavy cream, like not great. A little bit of butter, totally fine. Ghee is great. But again, I just from like kind of, since I'm in the autoimmune camp, and I like to think of these diets as healing modalities, rather than just, as an experiment in and of themselves. In my book, SIBO Made Simple, all the recipes are dairy-free, corn-free, gluten-free, I think sugar-free too. I can't even remember at this point. It's been a long time. But yeah, all the frees just to keep it as quote unquote clean as possible.
Okay. Now, you touched on elimination diet. Can you give us an example of what an elimination diet looks like? Because let's just say someone listening is like, okay, I want to try an elimination diet. Well, then what do I eat on the elimination diet?
Yes. So a lot of the freeze that I just mentioned are part of what I would say is like a typical elimination diet. So it's looking at the big allergens, dairy, gluten, corn, soy being some of the biggies. And I think it's a really interesting question because an allergen elimination diet is very different than a low FODMAP elimination diet. Like low FODMAP is really about like, again, it's symptom based. So it's about your digestive system and reducing symptoms and what you're triggered by or reactive to. An allergen elimination diet is really trying to see what you're having an autoimmune response to. So it's actually hard, even though maybe the number of things you have to take out is a little bit easier to wrap your head around. It's harder because you really do have to be fairly strict with it in order to get, an accurate answer on the other end. So usually it's 21 days to kind of take those things out of our diet and let our immune system die down completely. So if we have any antibodies to any of these ingredients, they've had time to clear our system. And why that's important is because a lot of us kind of have these low level reactions happening like all the time around the clock. We're eating these foods kind of often enough that we never give our body time to call back the troops. And so it means that our troops are constantly revved up and we are at like kind of a baseline of dysfunction and irritation. Whereas when you let those troops kind of recede and then you introduce, something that it has been taught to attack, you're going to get a much more dramatic response and a much clearer response to understand which foods are actually bothering you in that way. Whereas with low FODMAP, again, it's not necessarily the what in particular, the item in particular. It's about kind of food combining and quantity, how much you're eating. And it's also, your symptoms may last a day, but then it's kind of a new day. You don't have to worry as much about being like super duper strict. It's what I always say to people with low FODMAP too. They're like, oh my gosh, I've been eating I didn't realize broccoli wasn't okay. I've been eating broccoli. And I'm like, well, have you been having stomach problems? Like as a result, they're like, no. I'm like, then keep eating the broccoli. It's fine.
Right.
Like, or it's
Totally.
like, I have an event coming up. I'm really worried. I'm not going to be in control of my menu. Like, what if I eat blah, 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 eat some garlic and onion? That's fine. You may be miserable for 24 hours, but after that, you can kind of pull things back and start again and still get, an accurate response again to your triggers. But I do think it's like with the reintroduction for both of them, for both types of elimination diets, you really do want to do it in a strategic, measured way, leaving time in between reintroductions again, so that you can get back to a good baseline. Because otherwise, I don't think there's any point of it. Like you really do want to get those answers. You're going through the misery, removing all these things. You might as well understand yourself better on the other side.
Yeah. Well, for example, I think people are still looking for like a baseline of like literally a menu of like, what do I eat? And I've seen different people do different types of elimination diets. For example, they will eat eggs and avocado for like just a day. And then the next day they'll eat eggs, avocado, and rice and white rice, and they'll just literally keep it so simple, like no spices, nothing. And so I think trying to get like a good baseline, okay, eggs have, protein, fat, you got your avocado, maybe even just eggs. I mean, because maybe avocado, maybe it's too fatty, maybe it's too fibery. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
But what's your take?
I don't know people doing it that way because I feel like there are just so many factors. And then again, it's like, if egg is your trigger, then you've not given your, like,
could they be? Like, are they big triggers?
Yeah, egg is actually a big allergen. And a lot of elimination diets do take it out. I have a friend who's like she's on the autoimmune spectrum like me, Hashimoto's, has had tons of gut issues. And she was shocked by the elimination diet. Like she knew gluten was kind of bad. She thought dairy was bad, but no, it was actually for her, it was egg and poultry. And like when she reintroduced them, she literally projectile vomited. So,
Well,
um,
yeah, like so what is someone where's the baseline? Do they you
yeah.
know what I mean? Like they're like, what the heck do I start with?
Oh, I mean, again, I think you can choose whatever elimination diet like feels right for you. If you're doing an allergen one, some people like just like the quick and dirty, like I'm at 21 days. I can do anything for 21 days. I'll be a bit limited for 21 days and then start reintroducing. But you don't have to. You can kind of be like, okay, for 21 days, I'm just going to do dairy. I'm just going to take dairy out. And then at the end of those 21 days, I'm going to add it back in, see the reaction. If I'm fine, fine. Also, it's like if I still have all these symptoms during that 21 days of no dairy, maybe it's not the dairy, maybe it's something else, but you'll get some answers that way. And I do think that's why some people like to overlap the omissions, because then, you are hopefully going to be in a place for 21 days where your symptoms are a little bit more muted. But yeah, in terms of what you eat, I mean, I think that there's still a ton of variety. So one example, I would say pick up SIBO Made Simple because it's low FODMAP and like basically allergen free, although I do have some egg. So it's kind of like you'll be safe. And I kind of explain in it how to do the reintroductions for the low FODMAP diet and the reintroductions for the allergen based elimination diet, just so that you know exactly how to reintroduce. But if you want to kind of like hedge your bets and do it all at once, like all the recipes in there, will speak to you. And I think it's probably most complicated for people who are plant-based, because again, when you reduce the number of vegetables, when you reduce, certain
Beans
grains
are
and
huge for
whatnot.
plant-based,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. It can just be a little bit harder. Whereas, the average person, if you eat animal protein, you can keep things kind of simple. Like you said, just like have some eggs, have some chicken, like have some white rice. It's also like back to like the carb subject. A lot of people with SIBO like find that white rice is one of the only things they can tolerate.
So, can you explain why preparing our food matters, not just what we
Mm.
eat, and perhaps some methods of, like, for example, soaking or sprouting versus just,
Mhm.
eating it straight from cooking?
Yeah. So I actually think this is kind of a big area where, like, what we know about our blood sugar metabolism and what we know about our gut health overlap. And it's kind of the place where most people don't think about. We think about, oh, like, can we not tolerate carbs as well because of the gluten content, or because, our of the pesticides and the way our crops are grown, or just simply what people like just get hung up on the what. But the how, especially with the preparation, is so important. And when we look, I think it's one example where carbs are really interesting, because we look at how bread was made 100 years ago. We look at how pasta was made 100 years ago, and it's so different than in the industrialized fashion that happens today. And your example of sprouting grains, historically, when we were harvesting crops, the grains used to sit outside post harvest, through inclement weather, and they used to sprout as a result. And it makes nutrients more bioavailable. It makes grains easier to digest. And we can mimic that to some extent in our own kitchens by soaking grains. There are, some varieties and some brands that sell pre-sprouted grains. So that is an interesting place to explore. But then, I have done a bit of research or an investigation on pasta and bread. And, most bread was made with a real sourdough starter 100 years ago. And that's a bacterial process that eats a lot of the carb content and also reduces the gluten content in our loaves. Also today, when we make bread in an industrialized fashion, sometimes, we add more gluten in order to speed up, or reduce the amount of kneading that a bread takes, that a bread requires, because that gluten is important for the elasticity. And then in the industrialized process, we also reduce the rise time. So it's really, I say that this new book is slow carb, not low carb, because it's thinking about, even in the processes of how we cook things, the slow way is often so much better for our digestive system and so much better for our blood sugar. And then kind of in a macro sense, it's not about necessarily, removing all carbs from our diet when we're talking about blood sugar. It's about slowing them down so that they don't hit our bloodstream all at once. So again, slow carb. So another example that I thought was really, really interesting is looking into pasta, because you asked in the quick fire whether gluten is, I actually can't remember your question, but it was about gluten and whether everyone has a reaction, or whether, all carbs make our blood sugar spike. And, you know, pasta, you can say like one type of pasta may make your blood sugar spike and one type may not. And some of that comes down not even to the carb content, but how it's prepared. And specifically for people who are affected by gluten, who just don't have celiac disease, but find that they have like that gluten's just hard to digest. You hear a lot of the time people say, oh, like I go to Europe, to France and eat baguettes. I go to Italy and I eat pasta. And, maybe to some extent it is, the flour that's used, like the fact that they don't have Roundup over there. But I think that the underappreciated fact is that they just prepare things differently. So pasta is a really beautiful example. In Italy, the way that pasta is traditionally made is to slow dry the noodles until they're hard and shelf stable. A lot of people say, oh, well, like it's just that in Italy the flour that they use is lower in gluten, that's why I can eat pasta there. And the irony is that actually the grains they use, the durum wheat, the semolina flour, are higher in gluten. It's used specifically for pasta because, again, gluten makes a great pasta. It's what gives it that chewy bite, that elasticity. But what happens is that, they slow dry those noodles so that it's not kind of like a quick flash dry process that causes the gluten to seize up. And the example that I give to people who cook with animal protein is that, what happens when you take animal protein, like let's say a steak, directly from the fridge and put it in a hot pan to sear it. It'll seize up immediately and, reduce to half its size. It's going to, reduce no matter what, but it happens really, really quickly. It seizes up. And from a culinary standpoint, you don't want that because it's going to be tougher. It's not going to be as tender. The juices aren't going to be like distributed properly. And then, whenever you cook any meat, you want to let it rest on the cutting board before you cut into it. Because again, the protein is really sensitive to heat. So what happens when you kind of like flash dry the pasta noodles really quickly is that kind of the fine mesh of the gluten just is really seized up and that much tighter and that much harder for your gut to break down and for you to digest. So I would say that is the underappreciated answer for why some people, will eat certain things overseas, often like made in an artisan, slower way than they are here. And by the way, it's not like you have to travel to Italy in order to experience this. Just look in the grocery store. I think Italian brands are the ones that advertise it the most, but you'll see on the box sometimes that it says slow dried or lenta, which is the Italian word for slow.
That's such a great tip, Phoebe. I'm going to look for slow dry or lenta pasta from now on. I've also seen brands start making, quote, sourdough pasta. Again, I don't know if that's like a gimmick, but they say it's sourdough pasta, so it's been fermented.
Oh, cool.
Who knows if it's still quick dried or not? But I've seen the sourdough pasta now popping up.
And then I haven't tried it. That's interesting.
Yeah, be on the lookout. But I love the example that you gave about the whole cooking meat really fast. And like if anyone has cooked maybe a roast in or pot stew in a crock pot over time, and then it's so juicy and tender and it's just so plump. And I was thinking about that when you were giving that whole like a steak serenal example.
Yeah. So if you're big
great.
meat eaters and you want your meat to taste better, just take it out of the fridge like an hour before you're going to cook it. Let it be room temperature. That's kind of the pro tip.
Interesting. And then also, I want to kind of go back into the initial question of, how preparing the food matters and going into carbs specifically. Now, what is your take? Because this is I've heard and I've done it and I've experienced the benefits, but what's your take on cooking and then cooling your carb? Like if you cook a potato, put it in the fridge, and then you eat it cold, that it changes the chemistry.
Yes. So this is all about resistant starch. So I'll just take you back to the explanation about what makes different types of carbohydrates different. So fiber is a chain of glucose, but your body can't break it down. So that glucose never gets broken into pieces and absorbed through the small intestine. Instead, it passes on to the large intestine and then feeds our good gut bacteria, and then whatever remains gets eliminated. But so that's kind of by and large why fiber, and there are a few other reasons for this too, but why fiber is such a plus when it comes to your blood sugar and carbs, because it does not contribute to any sort of glucose spike. So resistant starch is a type of starch that acts like fiber in the body. Similarly, it cannot be broken down back into glucose and feeds our good gut critters. So normal starch is a chain of glucose that can be broken down. So if there's not a lot of fiber in that starch, that can happen really quickly, which is why people talk about kind of refined carbs being just as bad for your blood sugar as sugar. I wouldn't argue it's just as bad, but it can be broken down fairly quickly. So resistant starch there's kind of a higher percentage of resistant starch in a lot of uncooked grains. So like oats, potatoes, like uncooked potatoes. There's naturally a lot of it actually in legumes, a lot of resistant starch and a lot of insoluble fiber. So the funny thing that happens is that when we cook our starches, again, we're kind of converting that resistant starch into starch that does affect our blood sugar. But if we cool them, I don't know why this happens. I'm not like a hardcore scientist, but when we cool them, some of that readily available starch gets converted back into resistant starch. So it's kind of a way of reducing the carb count in your meal if you're someone who has to really pay attention to blood sugar. And I think it's kind of fun. It's not something that I religiously do, but I like to think of it as like, oh, this pasta that I had for dinner last night, when I have it the next day for lunch after it's cooled down in the fridge, and it doesn't matter, you can heat it back up and it'll still remain. It's going to be, a little bit friendlier for my blood sugar. So maybe I don't have to add as many veggies to my plate as I would ordinarily do, or just like think about some of the other strategies that I have in the book about mitigating your blood sugar spikes.
Yeah. Well, and I even have felt better personally after I eat something that's been cooked and cooled, like cold rice, cold potatoes. Like I will add actually cooked frozen sweet potatoes to my smoothies. And those are, I feel like I can digest them better versus like a hot sweet potato that I just cooked.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
But yeah, it is quite interesting about the cooking and cooling process. Now, this is an interesting question. There's some stuff going around on the internet, and I've done some research that overseas, they are now producing, quote, low-carb potatoes. Have you heard about this?
No, tell me.
No, I mean, it's basically they are selectively, apparently it's not GMO, but apparently they are selectively breeding potatoes with like a low carb species. And it results in a lower carb potato. And many people just don't know that a lot of the fruits and vegetables that we have today are actually selectively bred already. Yeah. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, that's so GMO. It's so this. It's like, no, there's actually organic, selectively bred berries and
Yeah.
banana in like
Oh, our fruit
apples.
is very, very different than what we
Yeah.
found a long time
Yeah.
ago. It's like 3 times the size and much, much sweeter.
Yeah. And so it's just like over time, right? So anyway, so they're doing that with potatoes and they say it's lower carbs and it's getting a lot of backlash, but I don't think it's that bad if they can produce something that's, that will help someone with their blood sugar or diabetes or whatever. But yet to come into the States. But I was just curious to see if you've heard of that.
Yeah, I mean, that's funny. I wonder how close it is to just like species of potatoes or, types of potatoes that we again have like eliminated from the food system because we have wanted, higher starch things historically. And same with fruit. It's like we have wanted bananas that are 3 times the size of a small banana
Right.
and much sweeter because that's what, people enjoy eating. But from a health standpoint, we probably should have kept some of the old species around, or I guess species is the wrong word, but heirloom varietals.
For sure. Okay. So I want to ask again, going kind of back to the whole SIBO, are there pro SIBO foods that we should be eating? Like things that can actually help get us over that hump. You know what I mean? Like taking certain herbs or things like that would help with that.
Well, there's, various treatment plans that I outline in the book. And I always emphasize for people that treatment is not the same thing as diet. For most people, like you will kind of have to do some sort of quote unquote kill protocol to get rid of the bacteria. Most people can't do that with diet alone. So I like to think about diet as a strategy for symptom reduction and then also for healing the gut post-treatment. A lot of people are like, oh, like I did my antibiotic regimen. I'm good to go. My SIBO's gone. I should be better, like me. But it's not usually the case because sometimes the treatment could cause even more damage in the gut. And then it's just a really slow process of healing. So a lot of broths, I think, are great, again, for getting that gut lining back where it needs to be. And with SIBO, in terms of like dietary approaches, it's also an area where I'm like, it's so much more the how than the what. Cooked foods for most people, whether or not they're cooled afterwards and eaten, but just like versus raw woody foods are going to be much easier for a stagnant or, dysfunctional digestive system to deal with. I have a lot of like really soothing pureed soups in there. And yeah, it's not necessarily that they're low fiber, but just in pureeing all that fiber into kind of microscopic bits, we're making it easier for our digestive system to deal with. It's kind of like our teeth are pre-chewing
Okay.
for us. Yeah.
Well, give us an example of a recipe in your newest book, CARBivore.
Okay. Well, just because we were talking about soups, I have a fall reset soup in there that's pumpkin based. It's got a little bit of quinoa in there. It's in the grains chapter, but you can easily leave it out if that's not on the table for you. But again, it's like it's one of those examples where like if you struggle with eating quinoa, and I have historically struggled with quinoa much more so than rice, in kind of a soup where it's really broken down, and where it's not as plentiful as again eating like an entire grain bowl of quinoa, you may have an easier time. It's actually a completely low FODMAP recipe. There's some broccoli in there as well, but again like a low FODMAP quantity. There's some carrots. I think it's like again kind of a good gateway soup for people who have struggled with fiber to eat a little bit more fiber and to get kind of like a diversity of vegetables back into their diet. And there's turmeric in there too. I love turmeric and ginger. Turmeric and ginger, SIBO ingredients, like check, check, check.
Okay, so those are definitely some pro, I don't want to say pro SIBO, but anti SIBO foods more so.
Yeah.
Okay, do you have any dessert recipes, or are these all more like meal based ones?
So the book CARBivore is organized by type of carbs. So there's an oat chapter, there's ancient grains, there's potatoes, there's corn, there's legumes, SIBO folks, just ignore the legumes. There's pasta and there's bread. So it's kind of different ways to incorporate those things. So I do have like one dessert in kind of each chapter, except for maybe potatoes. I didn't do that. But yeah, I do have some dessert recipes in there. There are these really yummy PB&J cups that are, made from really good quality dark chocolate. And then you can make like a raspberry chia jam and then use a little bit of peanut butter in there. They're pretty easy.
Mm.
Like they're kind of a fun fiddly thing
That
to
sounds
make.
super, yeah, super easy and super quick as well.
Yeah.
I love that you are, I mean, you have your own experience, you're human, and I love that you're open about your struggles, as I think a lot of people in the health and wellness space don't actually want to come out and say like, hey, like I even have like a cold or like a flu right now, because I
Yeah.
think unfortunately they get backlash from all their followers, and people are like, well, I thought you were supposed to be this like health guru, and how did you get the cold? And they're like, well, I'm human. And I think a lot of people just don't come out and say like, hey, I'm not feeling well today, despite all the supplements I'm taking or the diet. Like it just happens. And I just love that you're just human. You're open about it.
Yeah, it's something I was really nervous about with my second book, The Wellness Project. I felt like I had to be completely healed by the end of the experiment. And it goes to, again, your quick fire question of like, can you reverse Hashimoto's? You can. I know people who have done it. I personally have not done it. And I don't really actually feel like that's, a failure. It's just like kind of realistic for where I'm at. And antibodies are really hard to control. A lot of the time it's not, you can live the cleanest life possible, but if your mental health isn't under control, you're dealing with a lot of stress. And those are factors that we can't always control in our life. We may have a bad gut day. We may have higher antibodies than usual. I think it's a lot of people who kind of were diagnosed very early, who didn't have like quite as much, overlapping comorbidities as I did with my Hashimoto's, who end up reversing it. But I kind of feel like I was at such a bad place that I feel like 80% better is like really good for me. Like I feel like that's a new normal I can really live with, without getting to, again, without letting the stress of perfectionism kind of undo the goal.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like you said, there's so many different factors. Like you could just be constipated one day, and then being constipated can make you feel more toxic because there's more toxins in you, and
Yeah.
the stress of life, and just anything. Or maybe didn't have as much protein last week, so now you're feeling low, or you had too much dairy, or you know what I mean? Like there's
Mhm.
ebbs and flows. And so I think, anyone listening needs to just feel encouraged, because it's going to be like a roller coaster sometimes, but that doesn't
Yeah.
mean your health is unwell. It just means that there's factors in play.
Yep, absolutely. One of my favorite mantras is tomorrow there'll always be more kale, if you can tolerate kale. But it kind of stands in for whatever the wellness zeitgeist at any given moment is telling us we have to do in order to be healthy.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do have another question. So, last one, really. Are there any tips for those finding a doctor that
Mm.
can actually listen to them? Because I feel like most doctors just prescribe antibiotics and send them on their way. Like, what kind of tips can you give someone trying to find a practitioner that really wants to help?
Oh gosh, it's really, really hard. And I empathize with it. I mean, I don't even have like my go-to person anymore. He retired. Um, I think that listening to podcasts is an interesting gateway. People always email me about SIBO practitioners, and again, it's like I've only had the pleasure of seeing one person, so I can't really speak to anyone in actual practice, but I tell them to like listen to the podcast if anyone kind of speaks to them, their approach, like just their kind of their way about them, reach out. A lot of doctors these days will do telemedicine. So I think that's kind of the most encouraging way that the industry has moved because, especially people who live in rural places or, outside of urban centers, it can be even harder to find like a normal doctor, let alone a specialist, let alone someone with a holistic mindset who will listen to you and not just like churn you out the door. So yeah, I wish I had a better answer, but for people with gut stuff, definitely just like dig into, to some podcasts because there are a lot of specialists out there who are being interviewed, and especially in the SIBO space, there are a lot of naturopaths. There is a school out of Portland that turns out a lot of naturopaths and a lot of people with SIBO specialties. So they have a Rolodex. I can't remember if I have a link to it on my site, but I'll try and give you one if I do. But yeah, I think, if you can find certain schools that have specialties like that, a lot of them do have Rolodexes of practitioners and graduates who you can look into.
Yeah, and social media, it can definitely be a helpful tool for sure. Listening to podcasts and following certain specialists and things, people that are in that space. And then, you have your own podcast and obviously you have multiple books. So where can people find you online?
Yes. So you can find me on Instagram at Phoebe Lapine, just my name. You can find my blog, feedmephoebe.com, which has a lot of free low FODMAP recipes, just all gluten-free. And then my book is CARBivore cookbook.com. And I will say that if you Google CARBivore, it will autocorrect to carnivore, unfortunately. So don't do that. Just go to the website, CARBivorecookbook.com, and all of the links are right there, readily available to you. And then
Wonderful.
SIBOMadeSimple.com is also where you can find that book, but that's easier to Google.
Okay. Well, we'll be sure to put all those links in today's show notes so people can just go to today's show notes and just click with one easy tap. So thank you again so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Digest This. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a review in your podcast app to let us know. If you're ever wondering how you can support me and this podcast, sharing it with your friends and family is the best way. This is a Wellness Loud production produced by Drake Peterson and edited by Mike Fry. To check out more shows by my team, go to wellnessloud.com, and to email the show, message us at digestthispod@gmail.com. See you next time. The content of this show is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for individual medical and mental health advice and does not constitute a provider-patient relationship. As always, talk to your doctor or health team first.